Right, so this is part two in the lecture on the Great Depression and the New Deal, and President Roosevelt's first 100 days as president. So, again, that's the first 3 months as president. This is the second part of several of the laws that he put in place. So, we're going to pick up with the NIRA and the NRA, which is not the National Rifle Association, it's the National Recovery Administration, and the NRA is the has to do with industries and companies. So both of these laws were put in place to kind of put rules on what companies could and could not do. And again, kind of the overview of FDR's New Deal is increasing the government involvement in big companies. So something that the NIRA and the NRA did is they set up a minimum wage, a maximum hours, a maximum to hours people could work. It made sure that workers were being paid for working overtime, and it outlawed child labor. Those laws also had businesses cut down on overproduction, just like the farmers, to stabilize prices. And it also legalized labor unions and provided for them when bargaining with their bosses. Now, these laws and administrations were kind of the last straw, and they don't last because of a Supreme Court case that argued that these programs went too far and were unconstitutional. So they felt that government was too involved, and ended up getting rid of those laws. Roosevelt also had the Tennessee Valley Authority. So in Tennessee, this was the poorest part of the United States. Farmers were really suffering. Land in this area wasn't really good for farming because it was very hilly. And there were not a lot of other jobs in the area because there were no factories, since there were no electrical lines. There wasn't really electricity and power in the Tennessee Valley. So there weren't a lot of job opportunities. So Roosevelt targeted this area in particular, and he created the Tennessee Valley Authority. And what they did is they took water power from the Tennessee River, and they started building dams and power plants to create electricity. And they were hoping that with electricity in the area, more companies would build factories and use the electrical lines and the power to build factories and create jobs for people. So they were hoping to kind of build up the economy in the Tennessee Valley area, and it worked so well, and it's still around today. There's also the Securities Act. So the government passed laws that made most things that had contributed to the stock market crash illegal, so that things like buying on margin went away. So remember, we talked about how you could put like 10% down, get a loan, and invest most of that in the stock market. Well, now you had to actually have the money you wanted to invest in hand before you could invest. And stockbrokers became very regulated, so you had to take a test to make sure you knew the rules, and you could get in big trouble if you were a stockbroker and you broke the rules. Like, you would go to jail. Now, again, the government did not cause the stock market to crash, but because the government wasn't having any rules, because the government didn't put any rules in the stock market beforehand, the absence of rules helped contribute to the crash. So essentially the act is creating rules for the stock market. Roosevelt also created the Social Security Act, which was to help people who couldn't work, so people who had retired or were old. It was to help them get money. And that is still around today. So if you work, part of your paycheck goes to the Social Security program. All right, so the next couple of slides are going to be about different charts having to do with some economic changes. So there's some key vocabulary you need to understand. GNP is the gross national product, or the gross domestic product, and it is the value of all goods and services. So it's a way to measure economic growth, or how good your economy is doing. If the economy is growing, the GNP gets bigger. So you want a bigger number. And an example of how we kind of figure out GNP is if you look at all of the food that farmers are growing, the value of that food goes into the GNP. Products that are being made in factories or by hand are part of the GNP. The value of medical care by health professionals goes into the GNP. So that's an example of a service. Consumer spending is how much money, like, you and I spend. So When people make money, they also spend money. So if personal economy is going well or doing well, then personal spending goes up. Business investment is how much money businesses spend for new equipment and etc. So if you think about Founders Hall and TNCS, that was a business investment. My favorite example is the art rooms. So we invested money and made 2 fabulous art rooms to kind of give you the opportunity to kind of grow your art skills. Another example of business investment would be buying equipment. So if a farmer bought like a better tractor to work on the farms with, then that would be an example of an investment. They're hoping to end up making more money in the long run. Farm income is how much farmers make. So that kind of breaks down to it's determined by how much they grow and what they get for it. Weather also affects farms. Bank assets are the value of bank deposits and money owed to the bank. So that number, we get it from how much has been deposited or how much people put into the bank and how much people owe the bank. And then finally, unemployment is the number of people who are actively looking for work but who are not currently working. So again, it's only people who are looking for full-time work but are not currently working in a job. So let's look at some charts that kind of show the GNP. And remember, the GNP is the value of all goods and services, and the higher the number, the better. So we can see starting in 1890, the GNP starts pretty low. It's about $10 billion. And then it's growing steadily, and it kind of picks up between 1910 and 1920. We see in the 20s, it kind of reaches the highest it had ever been. And then in 1933, the Great Depression, so 1929 is the stock market crash. So we see between 1929 and 1933, this just plummets. The GNP plummets. And then it starts to pick up. And 1937, we kind of see as the end of the Depression. But it's going to take until after World War II before we finally raise our GNP above what it had been before 1929. So based on this chart, we can kind of see that the New Deal helped the economy recover and helped the GNP go up. And if you look at the chart on the right, we see the economy from 1929 to 1937. So the far left column is the start of the Great Depression, and we see everything like spending and the GNP drop and then slowly pick back up after 1933. Now, did the economy improve? Did the economy return to pre-depression levels? So this chart kind of breaks down the GNP, consumer spending, business investment, farm income, bank assets, and unemployment. So all factors kind of looking at how good an economy is doing. And so if you look at 1929, numbers are pretty high. Unemployment is pretty low. So people are spending a lot, they're investing a lot. GNP is $105 billion. And then in 1933, all of these numbers plummet. So we go from a GNP of 105 billion to 55 billion. Consumer spending drops from 79 billion to 47 billion, and so on. And then unemployment goes from 1.6 million to 12.8 million unemployed people in the United States. So 1933 was a pretty low year for the country. And then between 1933 and 1939, we start to see those numbers change. So they're slowly creeping back up to what they were pre-depression, but they're not quite there with the exception of like bank assets. And then unemployment slowly drops from 12.8 million to 9.5 million. All right, and then our final thing is we had to pay a price for these gains. So our federal spending rose, and it would continue to increase. So federal spending is like the money that the government is putting into the economy. And what this means is that the national debt ends up doubling. So in 1932, we were $20 billion in debt. And in 1939, it goes up to $40 billion. And it rises, the national debt is going to rise even more after World War II begins. All right.